Going, going, rolling. It's all
Ah,
yours.
thank you. Happy hacking.
Thank
Okay. Hey there. Hi there. Ho there. Um, Whoops, I put the wrong time in. I better do something about that. This is, of course, as you can see, left over from yesterday. I was originally going to do this yesterday, but so in general, I'm going to talk about, and I think I'll just show these two Rousseau things. Probably will bore people, but the point I'm trying to get to is something that is a larger project that I'm thinking about, and that is problems of distributive justice. But I need to sort of start that. And one of the issues that's come up with what I was doing on Don Monroe's book on Marx and land and rent and stuff like that was the idea that we can think about, what is going to happen under socialist economies, one way or the other. And we've been fiddling around with some of these issues of land, and similarly, um, justice has a reallocative sort of element to it. But in order to get there, I think we have to sort of look at some simple stuff first. And one is to sort of review what most people do. There's in the standard undergraduate courses is, look at social contract stuff, and to begin with the basics. So I'm going to show a video on Rousseau and the social contract, and then um, a video on applying Rousseau to a distributive justice. So that's kind of what we're going to do now, I think, if I can get it to run. Damn it. Oh, Christ. No, maybe it won't. Then I'll just skip that. You can look at it yourself. Theories of, so this is the basic thing from the internet philosophy page on distributive justice. So theories of distributive justice seek to specify what is meant by a just distribution of goods among members of society. Liberal theories may be seen as expressions of laissez-faire with compensations for factors that they consider to be morally arbitrary. More specifically, such theories may be interpreted as specifying that the outcome of individuals acting independently without the intervention of any central authority is just, provided that those who fare ill for reasons that the theory deemed to be arbitrary, for example, because they have fewer talents than others, receive compensation from those who fare well. Liberal theories of justice consider the process or outcome of individuals' free actions to be just, except insofar as this depends on factors in the form of personal characteristics, which are considered to be morally arbitrary. In the present context, these factors may be individuals' preferences, their abilities, and their holdings of land. See where that's where the land thing comes in. Such theories may then be categorized according to which of these factors each theory deems to be morally arbitrary. And so there's a kind of tension. And I think that you can see, because I've been sort of amused by the Libertarian Party, not only because they're just never really true libertarians, but they are an amusing force in American politics and problematic simply because, I don't blame the Green Party. I do blame the Libertarian Party for 2016 and Trump. Uh, Tension between the libertarian and egalitarian theories of justice. Um, so I came across this article that tries to combine all three of these things, and I'm not quite through the article yet, but this is from the abstract. And it's from a Chinese point of view, but it's essentially on the issue of Rawls, John Rawls, Robert Nozick, and the ideas of certainly of Marx. The the thing about Rawls and Nozick and Stanley Cavell and those kind of folks is that, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. The thing is that Harvard, to not to reference Feldo too much, but Harvard is a kind of hegemonic influence in in academia, and often certain ideas sort of stick around longer only because they're coming from the Ivies, and it is disturbing that that's the case, but that's just the way it is. It affects publishing. It has an influence that is hard to beat, but got to sort of deal with it that way. The problem of distributive justice, discussed by Western and Chinese scholarship in Marxism, and this the transformation of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe at the end of the 1980s, and the transition, the post-cultural revolution transition in the late 1970s, by conceptualizing the basic principle of distributive justice as quote unquote reward according to effort and ability. This paper discusses the differences between liberal thought, as exemplified by John Rawls and Robert Nozick, and the ideas of Karl Marx, from basic principles to context. It deals with the concept of private property or even private ownership. And note, of course, several days ago that I tried to emphasize, as most socialists do, and the difference between personal property and private property. And the problem of ownership and what the libertarians refer to as a kind of self-ownership. Although I wish they would actually talk more about self-ownership issues, because if they could clarify that, the American Libertarian Party would probably clear up a lot of their own kind of weird bizarreness. In Marx's view, the principle of distributive justice is necessarily betrayed under the condition of private ownership. That is, the capitalist exploits workers, and the solution is the replacement of private by public ownership. Ultimately, the principle of justice is replaced by the principle of beyond justice. And this question of how things are just or not just, and issues of property are kind of interwoven in all of this. Nozick sees private ownership as the natural result of the principle, a condition he regards as self-ownership. Rawls shares this position with Nozick, but seeks to improve its operation with justice as fairness, which combines the principle of justice with the principle of beyond justice. Whether that's good or bad is a whole nother issue. Neither Nozick or Rawls intuits that the principle itself would be betrayed under the condition of private ownership. And I think parsing this out is always problematic. Land is one of a defining principle in that particular sense of the difference. What are the boundaries between the personal and the private in that context, or the personal and the public? And it seems pretty clear that on the one hand, if you have too much state power, the personal becomes intruded upon, and any claims to libertarianism are just sort of thrown out the window. All all right-wing anti-abortion stuff is essentially that kind of problem. The issue of personhood applied to fetuses sort of fits in there as well. At some point, do you really want to give a fetus kind of self-ownership? Because then it becomes this weird standing question, right? You sort of well, we can do this for trees, or we can do this for the environment. Why can't we do this for that little cell in the whatever? Anyway, so I think the ideological issues are fairly clear. Some people, of course, insist that even talking about it is too weird or creepy. So anyway, back to the story at hand. Philosophers studied the concept of justice through political and ethical perspective, serving as individual ethics builders and social and political philosophy. For a society to fully understand justice, it's important to have a clear and systematic understanding of moral theories. Justice can be defined as the protection of individual rights and liberties based on the social contract theory, where the government is responsible for providing justice in cases of violated freedom. The international legal system strives to provide a practical and systematic moral alternative. However, traditional formulations of justice are limited and face challenges. A comprehensive view of moral philosophy incorporating rational and philosophical perspectives, substantive and normative ethics, and meta-ethics is necessary to establish the parameters of justice. This will help avoid piecemeal criticism and patching up of utilitarianism and allow for deeper understanding of justice. And then Rawls is a prominent author in the field of political justice who argues that decision theory and economics can effectively understand justice through a focus on the social contract tradition. On the other hand, Robert Nozick's highly claimed book challenges the social contract theory, arguing that it is a fraud and infringes on the individual rights of individuals, particularly the wealthy, through unequal taxation. So you can see that a libertarian theory would sort of manifest some of these same kinds of issues. And of course, when you try to work through some of the more universal elements of it, you get in trouble. Rawls introduced the idea of the original position in his book on justice theory. It refers to the theory of justice. It refers to a hypothetical scenario in which individuals are tasked with establishing the principles of justice for their society. The key feature of the original position is that individuals are placed behind a veil of ignorance. And what's interesting was when he talks about the veil of ignorance, is the same kind of discussion that you would get with the veil of money argument, meaning that they have no knowledge of their own race, gender, class, abilities, or other personal characteristics. This idea of, it can be seen as problematic simply because, this veil of ignorance under decision making, it can easily become money, but it really shouldn't. The idea behind this is that without knowledge of these factors, individuals would make decisions based solely on an impartial and fair understanding of justice. Now, this is that issue where you could hold everything else constant and sort of, there's a presumption of rationality behind this that I think we just simply can't adhere to. But, let's just simply sort of buy it for the moment, take it on assumption. Rawls believed that this approach would lead to principles that are fair to all members of society, regardless of their individual characteristics. For example, the principles established in the original position would include equal access to education and a fair distribution of resources. This would help create an environment where individuals have equal opportunities to achieve their objectives, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status. The original position is a central aspect of Rawls' theory of justice, and is often considered a cornerstone of contemporary political philosophy. Principles of justice is fairness. The first principle of justice established in Rawls' theory outlines equal fundamental rights and liberties for all individuals. These rights are considered crucial for securing the primary interests of citizens in a liberal and equal society. The principle allows society to think about ways to live a good life. An example of the first principle of justice is the right to freedom of speech and religion. This principle recognizes that individuals can freely express their opinions and beliefs without fear of discrimination or persecution. This freedom is considered a fundamental right that must be protected to secure the primary interests of citizens in a liberal and equal society. The principle of equal fundamental rights and liberties for all provides the foundation for a just society where individuals are free to pursue their own goals and interests. And you can see this is good in practice, but the notion that has gotten warped in the manipulation of the right wing of the state is that to claim that my freedom of religion is being infringed upon by gay people, for example, that they're infringing on my right to practice my religion is just this very bizarre distortion of this kind of idea. Second principle of fairness emphasizes equal access to education and employment for all citizens, providing opportunities for individuals to compete fairly for power, promotes diversity in the administration of justice. This principle also supports a guaranteed minimum income and equitable distribution of wealth, which helps individuals maintain their dignity and status as free and equal persons. All sounds very good on paper, but obviously the history intervenes. Now, Nozick's theory of justice, now obviously this is oversimplifying the notion, and you can see that there is it Rawls an underlying utilitarianism that it kind of overdetermines what happens there. That and you have to make so many assumptions about equity that can become problematic. Now, in Nozick's theory of justice, known as the quote unquote entitlement theory, note of course that can be problematic for some, rhetorically for some folks. states that individuals are entitled to keep the wealth they legally acquire and that it is wrong for the government to redistribute wealth. Nozick believed in the importance of individual liberties and the ability of citizens to accumulate as much wealth as they desire. According to this theory, justice is achieved as every person in society is entitled to what they have acquired through legal means. For example, an individual starts a successful business and becomes wealthy through their own efforts. And this is where it can be, it's the my stuff problem again. And without going into a big deal about it, well, ultimately what Nozick wants is something that, for example, certain people in the right wing want and the libertarians want is a minimal state, whatever that might be, one that is simply as others have referred to it, as a kind of watchman state. That is, the government is simply is Paul Blart, it's kind of that the rent-a-cops should never get in your way, but they do, which is the problem. Comparison of Rawls and Nozick's theories. Rawls and Nozick understand the importance of private property and individual ownership rights in a fair society. They believe the government should create an environment allowing citizens to exercise these rights and achieve their goals. Both Rawls and Nozick view personal liberty and freedom as critical elements of a just society and strongly emphasize these values. Rawls argues for justice and fairness, and Nozick for the entitlement theory, with both seeing justice as a fundamental principle. Furthermore, Rawls and Nozick acknowledge the importance of ensuring that citizens are equal regarding their opportunities. Rawls emphasizes this through his concept of the veil of ignorance, and Nozick emphasizes the importance of self-ownership. Now, the main difference between Rawls and Nozick's theories of justice is their views on the role of government in the distribution of wealth and resources. Rawls believes in a more interventionist role for the government in promoting fairness and equality. In contrast, Nozick believes in a minimal role for government and a strong emphasis on individual property rights and the ability to transfer and accumulate wealth freely. Rawls' theory of justice and fairness is based on a social contract where free and equal individuals agree upon the principles of justice. In contrast, Nozick's theory of justice, based on the idea of entitlement, holds that individuals have a right to the fruits of their labor and the government should not interfere with this right. So that's the overall way in which you can compare the two in a very simplified way. Now, there's issues that when we get down to the details, and that is the question of what counts as owning resources and owning self and owning land. And it is certainly possible to put a nice little diagram together that refers to the kind of ways in which we think about theory and the ways in which we can maintain liberty. And it gets more ugly in the details. The question of where are preferences in this, where are endowments or abilities, where's land in this, and that's kind of where it links to what we were talking about before. And on what scale do we define this liberty thing? And we know, of course, that the word liberty and freedom have pretty wacky and ideologically constrained elements. And the question of accountability or responsibility can be sort of parsed out. That is, self-ownership can be one thing for a concept of liberty and not so important for others. And we get down to some real basics about the question of how we consider property in a democracy. And this is sort of endless conversations that are essentially Harvard-type conversations. And I would assert that we need to move a little further beyond that. Come on. Bloody hell.
Building your online business? Go to Wix.com and set up your store on a single.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract in 1762 in France, at a time of great change. The moral authority of kings and the church was being continually questioned, as was political power in general, and the world was becoming less feudal and increasingly global and commercial. Commenting on man's condition in this changing world, Rousseau starts The Social Contract with his famous lines, "Man is born free and is everywhere in chains." In a discourse on inequality, Rousseau had argued that in a state of nature, man has two innate impulses, self-preservation, what he calls amour de soi, which means love of self, and pity, or a repugnance towards seeing suffering in others. He argues that in the course of evolution, man starts to become civilized by comparing himself to others through what he calls perfectibility, essentially man's capacity for mimicry and development by copying others. As man enters society, this amour de soi, the love of self, transforms into a more prop, which is a sense of his own self-worth. This stems from man learning from others, but simultaneously comparing himself to them, which diminishes his pity for others. Modern society is defined by a more prop, to the detriment of man, and so everywhere he is in chains, comparing himself to others. At the beginning of The Social Contract, Rousseau considers three ways of organising society that were part of 18th century orthodoxy: natural authority, right of the strongest, and slavery. Many at the time argued that rulers are like parents and the ruled like children, or that rulers are naturally better suited to ruling, or that if these aren't the case, maybe the strong should rule, just for the sake of stability. Rousseau makes a number of arguments against these that seem obvious to the modern mind, that children become independent from parents, or that even the strong can't rule with physical strength alone. He argues that all of these arguments have been made after the fact, that is, they have been made to justify the very state of affairs that they argue for, not the other way round. None of them fit the idea of man in a state of nature, with just a love of self and pity for others. So, he says that the only way a society can be formed is by a covenant, a pact, a social contract. He argues that even if people choose a leader, a social pact based on a prior agreement must have already been in place to begin the decision-making process. This is the basis of the social contract. So the question for Rousseau becomes how to find a form of association which will defend the person and goods of each member with the collective force of all, and under which each individual, while uniting himself with others, obeys no one but himself, and remains as free as before. This is the perennial question of political philosophy. In entering a political community, a state, you give up part of your freedom and submit to laws of the community. Anarchists argue that this is never justified. Is it possible to prove that it is? Rousseau's answer, he writes, is in the total alienation of each associate of himself and all his rights to the whole community. He goes on to say that, as every individual gives himself absolutely, the conditions are the same for all, and precisely because they are the same for all, it's in no one's interest to make the conditions onerous for others. For Rousseau, no one gives up their freedom for other individuals, but for the idea of an equal community. The community then is an abstract idea that is part of the individual. It is a concept that the individual creates rationally for himself. Rousseau conceptualizes a historical contribution to philosophy and psychology. This metaphysical community, or society, is what Hegel describes as Geist and what Freud takes inspiration from for the superego. It is arguably an inherent part of our own psychology. For Rousseau, this social contract should be organised by his most famous concept, the general will. It is this concept of a metaphysical community directed by the general will that is sovereign, not a king or a parliament. In a small community, each individual will be motivated by his amour de soi and his pity for others. In a community of equals, none will be motivated by the corrosive effects of amour propre, his comparing himself to others. Rousseau is not talking about equality of property, but equality of citizenship and direct democracy, that you have property on the basis that is afforded to you by the community. The community protects your individual rights, not the other way round. To act morally, then, is to act in accordance with the general will of the community, rather than one's own particular individual will. For Rousseau, giving up the freedom of natural liberty leads to a greater civil liberty. Politics should be judged on this basis, and leads Rousseau to one of his most infamous phrases. If an individual does not act in accordance with the general will, which, remember, according to Rousseau, would be rational for them to do so, then they should be forced to be free. This general will is worked out by the simple debating and voting of an issue, but importantly, each person should be directly involved in the process, and so Rousseau advocates small states and direct democracy, where interest groups and factionalism would be banned. Rousseau's fundamental belief was that society should be homogeneous, which has led many to accuse him of being one of the intellectual sources for totalitarianism, and put him at odds with liberals of the time like Voltaire and Montesquieu. Rousseau, then, is most aptly described as a communitarian thinker rather than a liberal, obsessed with how individuals, societies, and himself could lead cohesive, authentic lives. He argued that in an increasingly individualistic society, everyone pretends to be working for the other's profit or reputation, while only seeking to raise his own above them and at their expense. It's a world where sincere friendship, real esteem, and perfect confidence are banished from among men. Jealousy, suspicion, fear, coldness, reserve, hate, and fraud lie constantly concealed. Rousseau's influence and reputation is totemic. He was a leading contributor to the philosophy of the Enlightenment and had a major effect on the causes and the course of the French Revolution, which is arguably the defining moment in the creation of modern Europe. And in some way he's influenced almost every philosopher who came after him. Ultimately, the question in judging Rousseau is whether you buy into these fundamental observations about human nature, about pity. If you don't, then the rest of the social contract is unlikely to be convincing. If you like these videos and would like to support me making more, you can follow me on Twitter.
They hope you won't notice. CEOs sneak around, downsize favorite brands, charging more.
I've been talking about the nature of Rousseau's social contract, but I haven't yet addressed the question of distributive justice. So what exactly is his model of distributive justice? Let's start with this. The state, he says, is the basis of all rights. In the state of nature, people have no rights, and so all of them arise through the social contract. The state here becomes the basis of all rights. All rights are civil rights. There are no natural rights that the state could possibly violate. Every right is something issued top-down from the state. The state is what converts force into rights and possession into property. So all rights arise through the social contract. Well, that means the right to property itself arises through the contract. And what does that mean? You don't have any natural right to property, as Locke thinks. Therefore, there are no, in principle, restrictions on what the state may do with respect to property. So everything belongs to the state. You might say, well, then what principles am I adopting? What limits am I putting on the power of the state? Well, really nothing, except that the state must act for the common good. It must abide by the general will. Now, that does not mean the will of the people, as expressed in elections and so on. It means the common good, what is truly in the interests of the people. Now, Rousseau thinks the state will assign people private property. He doesn't actually want to get rid of it entirely. Marx will be inspired by Rousseau, thinking, but wait, you said the whole problem was the advent of private property. Let's get rid of it altogether. But Rousseau says, no, I don't think actually the best state would get rid of property altogether. But what it would do is put boundaries upon it, and it would make it subject to what he calls the general will. The general will is his term simply for the common good. The general will wills what is in the interests of the society at large. And so, property should be designed to promote the common good. It should be under the control of the general will. Now, this has a couple of important implications. One of them is that any property that you have is in effect granted to you by the state. It may be that you have a right to it now, but your right is subservient to the interests of the state. And so you are assigned property, but it's up to the state to assign it to you. And what the state gives, the state can take away. You don't have any right to property independent of what the state allocates for you. So there's no way to really complain that the allocation of the state is unfair, unless, of course, it is not in accord with the general will and doesn't promote the common good. What does this mean about distributive justice and about the right to property? Here's how Rousseau puts it. Each man alienates, I admit, by the social compact, only such part of his powers, goods, and liberty as it's important for the community to control. But it must also be granted that the sovereign is the sole judge of what's important. The state only has a right to control property to the extent that it serves the common good. But it's entirely up to the state, and specifically to the sovereign, the leader of the state, to decide what is important to the survival of the state, what is important to the common good, and so what property you end up getting. Well, how should the state do this in general? Are there bounds to this besides the common good? After all, we could agree with that without really having a determinate conception of what follows from that. But Rousseau does have an idea of the implications of it. He says, and here, as in a number of different places in Rousseau, the key point is in the footnote. He says, tolerate neither rich men nor beggars. Now, what does that mean? Well, we should allocate property according to the common good, according to the general will, but within certain boundaries. Nobody should fall below a certain level. Nobody should rise above a certain level. We've got to have a lower bound and an upper bound to property. Now, the lower bound, it's very easy to explain the importance of. He says, look, if somebody is a beggar, they are gaining no benefit through the social contract. As a result, not only is it a source of social instability, they have every reason to rebel against this and no reason to go along with it, but there's a deeper reason. If they do not benefit, it is not rational for them to agree to the contract. And that means that government authority with respect to them is illegitimate. So it's not just a social problem. If there are beggars, it becomes something that delegitimizes government authority itself. We cannot apply the rule of law to those who fall below a certain level economically because they no longer have any stake in the social contract. It is no longer rational for them to agree to the contract. And so our application of force to them is no longer legitimate. What about the upper bound? There Rousseau says there's a different sort of reason. Somebody who is rich enough to actually manipulate the political process in the state becomes a great danger. If you're rich enough, then you can actually open up a printing press, for example, or take over a newspaper, or today, take over a website, or take over some media organization that is significant in its shaping of public opinion. You can, in short, distort the political mechanisms that we use for determining what the general will is. How do we know what serves the common good of the society at large? Well, in a democracy, we put things to votes. We try to appeal to the will of the people. And under ideal circumstances, the will of the people matches the general will. It actually promotes the common good. But wait a minute. Does it always do that? No. The common good and the will of the people as expressed in elections can diverge radically. Now, why would that happen? Well, suppose you have wealthy people taking over media and distorting things to their own advantage, manipulating people to their disadvantage, but to the advantage of the wealthy. Suppose you have the wealthy hiring lobbyists to lobby legislators. Suppose you have them themselves financing political campaigns of legislators, of presidents, prime ministers, etc. Suppose they start playing a large role in various political parties. The rich can start having a disproportionate effect on the outcomes in that society. The more they control the means of communication, and the more communication there is, the greater the problem becomes. And so Rousseau thinks it's fundamental that we restrict the ability of anyone to become wealthy enough to start distorting the political process in this way. Ideally, there should be no lobbyists. Ideally, media companies should not be controlled by a few wealthy people. And in general, he says, we should be careful about communication. In fact, he says, really, the more communication there is in a society, the greater the power of the media in particular, the greater the danger of the will of the people as expressed in elections coming apart from what is actually serving the common good in that society. So he says, actually, the more communication, the greater the danger to a society. There are shades here of Homer Simpson. What we have here is a problem of communication. Too much communication.
Showing up on the first page of Google might not be the best for everyone. But for business owners,
John Rawls, as we saw last time on Then and Now, came to the following conclusions about what a just society should look like. He said that all social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the basis of self-respect are to be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution of any or all of these values is to everyone's advantage. But what would this look like in practice? It's only in recent years that commentators have started to question how this might be implemented politically. Rawls himself barely addressed the question, but he did suggest two possible systems: liberal or democratic socialism and property-owning democracy. And while he said that justice as fairness is between them, he himself leaned towards the latter. So what exactly is a property-owning democracy? First, to understand why Rawls favours it, it's important to see that all of his thinking grows out of the observation that under a veil of ignorance, in the original position, you would first want to secure your basic liberties. Political liberty, the right to vote and to be eligible for public office, together with freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, freedom of the person along with the right to hold personal property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure as defined by the rule of law. He says these are important because they are the basis of self-respect, without which you couldn't even enter the political discussion. So remember, for Rawls, we'd protect these above and beyond all else. The question then becomes, what systems would violate these basic liberties? Of course, we can reject authoritarian, feudal, aristocratic and fascist systems pretty quickly. But Rawls recognises that even in a free society, a disproportionate control of wealth in the hands of a few is going to infringe upon those basic liberties. How is someone poor going to compete with someone rich when contributing to the political process? Campaign funding, political advertising, access to the press and the corridors of power, party donors and elite dinner parties, and inequality of opportunity. Furthermore, all of the decisions about the future investments of society are in the hands of a small class of investors, politicians, and businessmen. If, as the difference principle demands, we're thinking about the position of the least advantaged, would we permit these inequalities? And what society would protect those at the bottom? What kind of society would fulfill the difference principle? Remember that for rules, resources, political power, and capital must be arranged so that any inequalities will benefit the least well off. Does our current system, welfare state capitalism, do that as well as it says? He writes, welfare state capitalism rejects the fair value of the political liberties, and while it has some concern for equality of opportunity, the policies necessary to achieve that are not followed. It permits very large inequalities in the ownership of real property, productive assets and natural resources, so that the control of the economy and much of political life rests in few hands. And although, as the name welfare state capitalism suggests, welfare provisions may be quite generous and guarantee a decent social minimum covering the basic needs, a principle of reciprocity to regulate economic and social inequalities is not recognised. The main point here is that the basic structure of society includes economic as well as political institutions. In other words, the distribution of wealth across society in the form of capital. To be consistent with the difference principle then, no one should be excluded from having some access to or say in the decisions about this productive capital. In other words, everyone should have a stake. This leads rules to property-owning democracy. A property-owning democracy means citizens have a real stake in the productive capital of society, some ownership in the means of production. Rawls writes, property-owning democracy avoids inequalities not by redistributing income to those with less at the end of each period, so to speak, but rather by ensuring the widespread ownership of productive assets and human capital, educated abilities and trained skills at the beginning of each period. If all citizens had a stake in a sizable amount of property, access to capital and the productive decisions of society, it would prevent power from resting in the hands of a few. He goes on, significant political and economic inequalities are often associated with inequalities of social status that encourage those of lower status to be viewed both by themselves and by others as inferior. Furthermore, the idea is also consistent with equality of opportunity. He writes, those who have the same level of talent and ability and the same willingness to use these gifts should have the same prospects of success regardless of their social class of origin. So, what would this entail in practice? Political thinker Tad Williamson has argued that a property-owning democracy should make sure that each citizen has a stake in three main assets: home ownership, cash savings, and stock holdings.
Congratulations, graduates. You now have a degree in psychology, philosophy.
Oh, that guy's great.
Home ownership would make sure people have a stake in their communities. Williamson argues that governments should subsidise things like mortgage payment insurance and grants for first-time buyers, introduce the right to purchase homes rented for a certain period of time. A cash fund for citizens could be used for certain purchases, limited to education expenditures, business grants, vehicle purchases, etc. People could be granted a lump sum at 21, for example, or receive a universal basic income. Stock holdings suggest a kind of entrepreneurial society. The public should own shares in large monopolies and publicly owned companies, the dividends from which could also be a form of basic income that could supersede the need for a cash fund. But how would these things be funded? Other than raising taxes and implementing a wealth tax, many have argued that Rawlsian policies should focus on pre-distribution rather than redistribution. Pre-distribution includes policies like minimum wages, capping price increases on rail fares and bankers' bonuses, investment in public education, and importantly, taxes on the transfer of wealth like inheritance. Inheritance should be taxed according to the wealth of the beneficiary and with steep tax brackets. Gavin Kerr has argued that a land value tax would also be important. A tax on land rather than on property arises from the idea that land cannot be monopolised and that the value of it depends on social things like roads, railways, bridges, the community and its amenities. The value of the land goes up as these things improve, but only the owner reaps the rewards under the current system. Even Churchill was a fan. He said, "Roads are made, streets are made, services are improved, electric lights turn night into day, water is brought from 100 miles off in the mountains, and all the while the landlord sits still. Every one of these improvements is affected by the labour and cost of other people and the taxpayers. To not one of these improvements does the land monopolist, as a land monopolist, contribute, and yet by every one of them the value of his land is enhanced. He renders no service to the community, and he contributes nothing to the general welfare. He contributes nothing to the process from which his own enrichment is derived." So when we're thinking in terms of the difference principle, people who don't have a stake in the property of a community don't benefit from the improvements to that community. In short, land speculation is unearned, undeserved, and inconsistent with the difference principle, as people who don't have a stake in the land and the land surrounding where they live aren't benefiting from the communal improvements that everyone is making. Some have argued that there is much common ground between the idea of a property-owning democracy and democratic socialism, and in some cases little difference, as worker co-ops, councils and community banks all ensure workers and the community are in control of the means of production. But Tom Mallison argues that a property-owning democracy would still leave decisions on investment, acts of building the future, as he puts it, in the hands of private individuals, especially in areas like social housing, education, transport, public goods. He says that rules underestimate how important workplace democracy is, the place where people spend the majority of their lives. Focusing on this is just as important as ensuring that everyone has a stake in property. For Rawls, a property-owning democracy is essentially an expression of the idea that you would only agree to a market system if everyone had the capital to enter that market, and that no one would agree to start a game of Monopoly, being the only player without money. Hey everyone, I feel very lucky to be able to say that I'm finally at the point where
Well, we solved it all, haven't we? All right. Democratic socialism solves everything.
Good starting point.
It is. Actually, I think all of these things are good, and they represent certain positions in history. You could say that Rawls is influenced by, the kind of post-war, productivity of the American economy, and reflects a kind of a conversation that he's having, with at Harvard, essentially, with a variety of other folks, talking about things like economy and politics, and philosophy, etc. So it is symptomatic of that age, and but ultimately it is this problem of wealth. How is it that the problem of a unfair tax system, or a tax system at all, if you want to take a more libertarian point of view to it, this idea of sanctioning a kind of, or warranting a kind of selfishness, libertarian selfishness, or at least the right-wing version of it, is incredibly problematic for a democratic society. then again, if you can get rid of democracy, it doesn't matter, right? That's kind of where we're headed now.
That's where we're headed. Yeah.
That's the Trumpian model, is that no, it's really not about democracy. It's about something else, and just you have freedom. That should be enough. Why bother having democracy?
It's the freedom of the properties to
Yeah, the property
exercise power.
Well, it's property classes, and it's and the commentaries on techno-feudalism. I think you can show that if you present something that has this value, whatever that might be, but it's not identical to wealth. That's the problem. That's the kind of mystification that comes with all of this. That's I mean, it is why I find the American Libertarian Party always amusing, because they don't seem to understand. They want to constrain certain elements of the state. They want to minimize force, but then they want to screw with stuff and still support certain, they want to fence off certain varieties of selfishness, and it always is just strange. And people, in their prior conventions, people show up like these folks who believe in natural law, rather than the social contract. If there is something, that it comes from something else, and it's a kind of weird scientism, right? And then they sort of mention physics somewhere in there, and it just gets really bizarre.
Oh, did they mention quantum physics?
Well, not quite. I think that they do believe in it, and it has this other thing going on, and of course the natural law folks are partially at least the natural law party. I think they have this other side thing with and I still can't figure it out, but with transcendental meditation, so it gets really wacky. But it's still all this thing. It's about cult, and sort of this is the thing that we believe. But coming to the Libertarian Party as a kind of platform is just strange. But it was there. And then there was a couple of other. There's something called the Constitutional Party, which was essentially another version of conservative Catholicism, where it was about anti-abortion. So, if you come to the Libertarian Party against the imposition of force, which is the way the Libertarian Party has been constituted, and yet you want to force people to not have abortions or whatever, it's just sort of this bizarre contradiction. So that's what go ahead.
Their definition of force is very circumscribed.
Oh, yes.
They don't see owning a business and being able to establish all the rules, the work conditions, the wages, all the decisions that can be made by the owner, and that the people that work there have none of that.
Right.
They don't see that as force.
No.
Right.
Which of course it is.
But no, I mean, absolutely, Prop John. I mean, that's yes, exactly. That's my rage at the libertarians. But just coming from their point of view, I'm curious about this, Ann Lee, because my understanding of the classical libertarian is law enforcement for public safety, protection of private property. I don't know. Are they in favor of military force? Probably only for defense. How do they justify the abortion thing?
Well, I don't think there's any, from a classical sense, there's no defense of it. But it gets into this other thing that that it's out of the bounds of that. There should be, I don't know. I can't. It's an undefendable argument. They use it. That there's some original principle at work, and then it verges off into religion. So I don't. I don't understand it, I guess. And but I like Libertarian Party conventions, because there's this obnoxiousness about it that that is somewhat refreshing. It's not as constrained as you know, the duopoly party. Um, that well, you know, was it last night or the night before last? You know, there was a motion to tell Trump to fuck himself. So I just like that. I I've never heard that at the Democratic Party convention, for example.
Did it carry?
No.
Oh,
They're a party that likes, you know, being wild, but not really being wild, which I always find amusing.
I mean,
Anyway, yes,
Rousseau's.
so that's kind of
I wonder if we could talk about Rousseau a little bit. Um, his idea
yes.
of the general will, which does not always equal the popular will, the will of the people,
Oh yes.
and the common good. Um, I mean, who determines what the general will is if it's not the people?
Well, that's the issue of the of this other outside thing that verges into religion. I would say Rousseau has some, you know, that the religion of his time still had that kind of, you know, the fact that you would have pity on someone, for example. You know, it all sort of fits into this idea of something else out there. You know, I think it's important to, well, it is about rank, isn't it? There's general will, major will, private will, corporal will. Anyway, all these Bill characters. But anyway, the greater good question is, you know, that's kind of what Rawls and Nozick are worried about. You know, what is this, you know, other thing? And I think the expectation is that we all have some, and the philosophers would move it into a position that says, well, you know, it's like suppressing all irrationality, and that we all become more rational, whatever that means, and that we all become more reasonable in that same sense. That's a kind of, you know, totalizing effect of the Enlightenment, right? That we would all achieve a certain ability to get along with each other and not have the need. I mean, if everyone could do it, right, we wouldn't need armies or whatever, yeah, or
Yeah,
cops.
I do think that the ability to get along with one another increases as certain things are met. You know, certain material needs are met, and also non-material needs. But you know, if people have what they need, and then a lot of what they want, I I I I think there's less likelihood of having this kind of tension in society. I think a lot of that, it becomes a lot easier to get along.
Yeah, no,
I
no,
mean,
And if people are educated and if they are trained in ways to interact with one another to minimize um, disagreements, you know, conflict resolution, respect for democratic procedures, etc., then that too is going to help. It's never going to be perfect, certainly.
you know, but
Uh,
how would people learn that? Would they learn that in a school that
yeah,
practices you know, classroom management? I don't know.
well, no, I mean, school, you know, all institutions would have to become more democratic.
Indeed.
I mean,
well,
you wouldn't have Columbia University, for example. You
no,
know,
can I? No, the fact that you brought that up is a great segue for what I wanted to bring up, if it's okay, John, the
go
Columbia
ahead.
University issue. So, both in Zoom and later on Discord, I had a bit of back and forth with henchmen on the issue of protests on campus about the atrocities in Gaza. And we talked about a lot of things, but two comments he made to me touch on this idea of democracy, the people's will, the common will, etc. He, he seemed to be indicating that, like, if the majority of the students didn't care or supported Israel, why let this group fuck everything up? But he didn't say that exactly, but here's what he did say more specifically. And again, please don't, this is not about henchmen. It's just, because he really does try and think things out, honestly. Just, but at the UW, because I made some comments to him about the history of protest at the UW, including something at the engineering department or school here that had to do with, okay, very good, Joe, had to do with military contractors, and he was suggesting that the groups protesting the university's complicity or involvement with these things were like, well, what if there are students that want to go to engineering school to work on sophisticated weapon systems?
Oh, dear God.
Right. But okay, let's just think about this. Let's think this through, though. So what he was saying, because you just said maybe universities can be more democratic. My thought is, I don't know if that's the role of the university, right? And I thought this when he said this. I'm like, the protesters are taking a moral stance. They're saying, we don't want this institution we're part of to support this death cult industry. And but what do you say to the idea that, well, what if you were to survey the whole campus and the majority of students were fine with that? Like, to me, for me, in my viewpoint, that does not settle the question. But when you talk about a democratic university, I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Would that not be an example of that?
Well, there's different ways to organize it, right? One is to say everyone is free to protest whatever their position. Another is to do as you're suggesting, where you survey the student body on a particular issue, and the majority carries the position.
No. That's not what I was saying. I was saying the exact opposite.
Oh,
because I think the majority would carry that the university should support or not, or at the very least, not interfere with Israel's actions. They would support the engineering school working on these weapons. I don't know, but that's just my hunch. But no, I was definitely not saying that. I was calling into the question the very idea that that would be a way to manage an institution. And yeah, there's the whole issue of do you protest or not? But what Henchman was getting at was less when it comes to this particular issue of these weapon systems. He was getting more into, well, if there's students that want to go to the engineering school and want to participate in learning those things, well, why do other students have the right to say they shouldn't? Now, I think because it's not about interfering with those others, the engineering students' rights. It's about protecting human life in Gaza and all over the world. Yeah. So, I'm actually questioning the idea that some kind of representative democracy makes sense on an institutional level.
Well, what we have now is a essentially dictatorship of some private individuals who get their power from a board of trustees that represents the powerful and wealthy in the country. I don't think that's a superior arrangement to determine how a university is run and what values it stands for. You can have you don't have to have a position of a university on a particular issue. You can allow the